Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley and the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. I have the pleasure of working with many leaders in Silicon Valley, and among the things that show up in my office, the quality of leadership is a frequent topic. Stories emerge when leaders are kind and inspirational, and of course, stories emerge in toxic ways when leaders are unkind, unconscious, or even bullies. I have taken great interest in how leaders step into their roles. Not only does it impact the people in their company, but their actions have ripple effects that go far beyond the walls of the enterprise they serve and into the homes of employees and local communities. Over the last several decades, I think most of us have come to understand the impact that our leaders' emotional intelligence can have on our collective performance as well as our individual well-being. And that is why I am so glad to host my friend and colleague, Dr. Yossi Amram. Yossi has been a leader in various capacities throughout his career. He has been the CEO of 2 publicly traded companies. He has taught at Stanford Graduate School of Business. And in addition to being a licensed psychologist and an executive coach, he has a Harvard MBA and an MS in engineering from MIT. Truly, Yossi is the right person to talk to us about spiritual intelligence and how it can impact leadership regardless of one's religious leanings. Yossi's and others' research has shown that the qualities of spiritual intelligence have a tremendous business payoff in terms of organizational productivity, team morale, employee commitment, as well as financial performance. Most impressive, it can be implemented by anyone regardless of their spiritual affiliation. Even if a person is atheist, these leadership qualities apply. Also promising is that research shows spiritual intelligence contributes to many other domains of functioning beyond leadership, and I believe that they matter to us all. These include things like satisfaction with life, quality of life, better self-care, general health, happiness, work productivity, job satisfaction, and resilience, just to name a few. So if these measures are important to you, and I'm guessing they are, then listen in as Yossi and I discuss the compelling case for spiritually intelligent leadership. Dr. Yossi Amram, who has asked me to call him Yossi, welcome to Super Psyched.
Thank you, Adam.
It's such a pleasure. I've been a fan of yours for north of a decade. And for those not familiar immediately with Yossi's work, you've been a CEO 3 times. You have leadership experience in a host of areas, both domestically and internationally, and 2 publicly traded companies, I might add, that you were the CEO of. You've got a Harvard MBA. You've taught at Graduate School of Business at Stanford. You've got an MIT background as well, as if that weren't enough. And of course, a doctorate from a rather spiritual institution when it comes to psychology. It was at that time called the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. So just a really interesting trajectory when you think about kind of convention. And then you went into kind of the spiritual and even cited Stephen Covey as describing spiritual intelligence as being kind of the quality amongst leaders.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. I'm honored and I'm excited to be here.
Likewise. And as I mentioned in the intro, I'm sure the fact that you are a licensed psychologist and executive coach. And I imagine that when you tell people at the proverbial cocktail party, hey, I'm really into spiritual intelligence, inspirational leadership, I imagine eyebrows go up and there are some perhaps poorly conceived ideas of what it actually means versus what it actually means. I was wondering if you could tell me both what people think when they hear that you are into spiritual intelligence and inspired leadership, as well as what it actually is.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, right on. Yeah, surprising, but most people have not heard the term spiritual intelligence. Perhaps I shouldn't say surprising, but hopefully it's becoming more and more recognized. So people kind of look at me funny. What is it? So briefly, it's very analogous to emotional intelligence. And this relates to how I got into this thing, if I could tell a little bit of a story. So I was in the world of leadership as a CEO and as a coach, and I had always been interested in psychology and spirituality kind of on the side. And I learned of emotional intelligence primarily through the work of Daniel Goleman's book that popularized it in 1995. And then I had my spiritual awakening and so on. I could talk some more about that, but I was interested to see how does spirituality relate to leadership. And I knew about emotional intelligence. And then I heard the term spiritual intelligence, which was actually coined not by me, by this author, Dana Zohar, that wrote a book in 1997 called Rewiring the Corporate Brain. And she postulated this idea of spiritual intelligence, but she never really operationalized and defined how to measure it. And I was interested to see, okay, what is that? And can it actually contribute to leadership in a way that's analogous to emotional intelligence? So I set on this path to understand what is actually spiritual intelligence. Can we measure it? And does it positively affect leadership? Another tidbit, kind of a thread here, if I go on a tangent, while I got my MBA at Harvard, one of our classical first business school cases was, what's the difference between managers and leaders, by this professor who was also a psychoanalyst, but Abraham Zalesny. And he asked, what is the difference between managers and leaders? And managers manage resources, make decisions, but leaders inspire. Leaders inspire. So you just listen to that word. And what is the root of that word, inspire? It shares root with the word spirit, which means the breath of life, the animating breath of life. So leaders inspire their people, inspire their organizations. They breathe life. They bring people together. They create cohesion around a shared vision and mission. So to me, things started to click, but it was still to measure it, to provide scientific backing that this thing actually makes sense as a psychological construct that meets all the academic criteria. I had to research that. So basically, though, what it is, just like emotional intelligence means drawing on emotional resources to enhance functioning and well-being. Spiritual intelligence is the ability to draw on emotional, spiritual qualities and values to enhance daily functioning and well-being. So these would be qualities such as service, purpose, joy, truth, discernment, and so on, transcendence, inner wholeness, holism. And these are qualities that have been hailed throughout the world's wisdom traditions as qualities that enhance our well-being, or forgiveness or compassion. I'm just kind of rattling a few of those. So spiritual intelligence is basically the ability to embody these qualities in daily life. So that's very distinct from spirituality or a spiritual experience. You might be meditating, you might be praying, you might be walking in the woods and have an experience of oneness or the solution of your separate self or ego, or feel connected to some transcendent reality. That would be a spiritual experience. Or you might have a spiritual belief, like a belief in God or higher power or the immortality of the soul, etc. Those are all beliefs. But spiritual intelligence is not about beliefs, not about experience. It's about the ability to embody these qualities that I mentioned in our daily life. So whether I'm driving on the freeway, or I'm in the checkout line in the supermarket, or at work, or I'm in my relationship with my romantic partner or my family, do I embody compassion? Do I embody egolessness? Do I embody humility? And so on. And the good news is that now it's almost 20 years since I started this whole effort and research. There's been numerous studies that show the benefits of spiritual intelligence, and it's academically validated as a construct that's complementary to emotional intelligence. So both of them support and enhance functioning, but they each add their unique contribution, even though there is some overlap, which I could talk some more about. Anyway, that's a long thing to your brief question.
And we will probably continue to answer that question over time. But before we even do, some people may think, I've listened to books on how Machiavellianism or how harder tactics work, what is the business case for spiritual intelligence? What is the business case for the type of inspired leadership that you are suggesting as part of the conversation as it relates to leadership? What are the outcomes that appear to be correlated with spiritual leadership?
Yeah, thank you. So, in fact, my doctorate dissertation was very much looked at that. And that was my motivation because I was involved in coaching CEOs of tech companies. And I wanted to see, is this just a nice to have thing, or is it something that actually translates into effective business? So I did a study with 42 CEOs and 210 members of their staff, and I controlled for emotional intelligence, which was well established. I controlled for personality, which is also known to contribute to leadership with qualities such as extroversion, etc. So I wanted to see, does it actually make an incremental contribution? And in that study, the CEOs that scored higher on spiritual intelligence were better leaders in terms of their commitment, the employee a follow-on commitment, intention to quit. They had lower turnover. People felt a greater sense of shared belonging and identity and commitment to the mission, higher morale, and all of those things that spiritual intelligence explained. And so spiritual intelligence explained, if I'm remembering correctly, 47% of the variance in the quality of leadership as rated by the followers in these measures, as I mentioned. Emotional intelligence explained 41%. So it was also contributing, but actually slightly less. And together they explained 67% of the variance. But what was really fascinating was that the leaders' self-assessment of their spiritual intelligence explained their followers' perception of the quality of their leadership, while the person's self-assessment of their emotional intelligence did not explain the followers. So it proved to be more significant, but emotional intelligence, but in a complementary way. In another study by other researchers in a different context, they looked at a bunch of business units and looked at, again, emotional intelligence and spiritual intelligence using the measure I developed and using the Baron measure of emotional intelligence, was probably one of the most widely used and academically validated measure. And they found that the leaders that scored higher on spiritual intelligence, their business units produced better financial outcomes than the others, while the measure of emotional intelligence did not provide that. So I thought that was kind of interesting. In another study among banks in Malaysia, they looked at employees' spiritual intelligence, and they found that banks that had employees with higher average spiritual intelligence had better financial returns in terms of return on assets and other objective measures of their business performance of those banks. So I think the case is pretty compelling from a business standpoint.
Well, I absolutely am on board. I've interviewed various servant leaders and modern leaders such as Steve Kerr, who's taken the Warriors to, I think it's 5 titles of the NBA, some crazy number like that. And he did it through kind of, I'm just going to do a side by side. If you look at the Indiana University coach, whose name escapes me at the moment, but he was famous for throwing chairs across the court at his players in just incredible anger. One of the things that I kind of have gleaned from that is you can get short-term results by being a bully, but in terms of long-term commitment and reducing the likelihood of quiet quitting, which is omnipresent in the corporate sphere where people are not engaged, or reducing attrition, when you think about how expensive onboarding is and onboarding the right people and keeping them engaged in a sense of ownership, what you're speaking to really makes sense to me. I'm wondering, of the spiritual qualities that seem to be most salient as they relate to, say, a leader, what are they? Are there any that seem to be more valued, or are they all equally important?
Well, I think, first of all, it's worth to mention, there's like 22 qualities of spiritual intelligence and 25 dimensions to inspired leadership, which basically map one-on-one to the spiritual intelligence. And in a sense, they all contribute Now, it all depends on the context, but definitely vision is important. A sense of purpose is important. Service is important. There's been a study by Bain and Company looking at 2,000 employees across different industries. And one of the qualities they found that most contributes to leadership had to do with humility and service orientation. So servant leadership. So, Jim Collins is a well-known author in the leadership domain, and he's done studies and looked at financial performance of public companies. And he found that the companies where the leader had combination of humility and fierce resolve produced the best return over the long run. So humble leaders, and that doesn't mean that they're weak. So there's confusion between humility and egolessness and meekness or self-flagellation or low self-esteem. Actually, humility and self-confidence can go well together. And so I just named a few. I think joy would be another one. Everybody likes to work with people that bring joy. And I think beauty is an important one. For example, Steve Jobs, I think his greatness, he might have not been a great spiritually intelligent person, but he had strong vision. He had a sense of beauty, and that inspired people, and people wanted to follow him. The other quality I would think is hugely important is trust and relatedness. So people want to trust their leader and feel connected to them. So you have to have that basic trust, both interpersonally as well, trust in the future, in that there are possibilities, and that trust supports optimism and hope that motivates people to stretch. If we don't believe things are going to work out, we're not going to be motivated. So a quality of trust would be super important for a leader, and then trust that somehow whatever will happen, we can work through it. And that leads to resilience. And then certainly integrity would be super important. People to trust their leader, they need someone who walks the talk and they could trust their word, and that they treat them as not just objects and as means, but relates to them with caring and compassion and relatedness. So I think there's a case for many of the qualities that are in this inspired leadership or spiritual intelligence that be important. Another one, if I were to throw out here, would be synthesis and holism, which is in the old days, companies used to compete based on either cost, we were the lowest cost producer, or quality or highest service. And it was kind of an either or mindset. And are we engineering driven? Are we customer driven? Are we marketing driven? What have you? And I think great leaders synthesize and look at problems holistically and move from either or thinking to a both and approach. So we have to be innovative based products and also provide low cost and good quality service. And the greatest companies move beyond that paradoxical either or thinking. And best leaders can provide that holistic synthesis of seemingly conflicting values to something that is a both and.
It's interesting. As you're talking, I'm going back to my own corporate experience with different levels of spiritual acumen amongst the leaders with whom I've worked. And I remember the paradox. One of my bosses said, we've got to motivate the team. And I remember thinking, wow, here this is coming from a guy who actually doesn't walk the talk. And how do we even begin to motivate the team when this guy's not even showing up? He's lost all trust, to your point. And then I think about something that Michael Meade said, and that is that we are not Homo sapiens, we are Homo symbolicus. We are meaning-based creatures. And everything that you're speaking to corresponds with that notion of the fact that we, in our deepest wiring, must find meaning in what we do, and ideally joy. That when we are at our best, I think about, again, I'm going back to the Golden State Warriors. When I think about the most joyful person I've ever seen in any sport, for sure, it's got to be Steph Curry for me. When he's in the pregame workout, when he's playing in the game, he is just emanating joy. And lo and behold, Steve Kerr, when I interviewed him, he said that joy is one of the 4 pillars, that he actually uses joy, mindfulness, compassion, as well as competition. And that those have been his 4 posts. And this is everything you're talking about. When we experience joy, I believe we experience less fatigue
and more creativity. Yeah, and that gives us energy and fuels us. So just to build on your joy theme, one example would be Southwest Airlines. and their CEO founder was very spiritually oriented, and they created a culture that was based on fun and joy. And it was both an internal value, but also a value that was associated with their brand. And you would go on a Southwest airline and they'd be telling jokes, and it was fun. And I think that differentiated them. And that was an example where they motivated their employees with fun and joy, and they motivated and drew their customers.
100%. I love flying Southwest for that reason. Usually the person on the PA has a bit of a sense of humor as they're conveying something rather grave in case of a water landing. They obviously take safety very seriously as based on their record, but they also find a way to put levity into an otherwise tense situation, which I think benefits every stakeholder, whether it's the employees themselves or the people flying in the airplane as paid passengers. I want to go, though, for a second, because one of the things I really appreciate about you in particular, Yossi, is that in spite of your incredible background, you really have that growth mindset. You are constantly challenging yourself. I see that in your writing. I've heard that in our conversations. And you appear to have that humility, that hunger to learn more and do better. And I wonder if we were to talk to Yossi of today and have him go back in time and inform Yossi, the CEO of a decade or two ago or more, what would have been the things that you would have said, lean into this more to your previous self?
Well, I think I fell prey to what a lot of entrepreneurs and founders fall into, which is our egos get identified and we take our businesses so personally, and it becomes and that provides great drive and energy and motivation. But on the other side, it can paralyze us with fear of failure and so on. So I would get pretty attached to certain outcomes, because so much of my identity and my self-esteem was tied to that. But if I could have kind of been devoted to the vision and the mission that I had without making it about me and my self-esteem and my saying, and I'm going to be this and that, which was paralyzing and kind of led to some of my burnout and my spiritual emergency and my dark night of the soul. So but that's easier than done.
Of course. And so what you're speaking to, though, is that not only do the teams benefit, but the leader, him or herself, benefits by stepping into these spiritual practices. And I'm wondering, what do you imagine would have been the effect on the team itself if you had been more able to step into that perspective? And how do you imagine you would have been impacted by being more aware in this domain?
Well, I think because I was so identified and at times tight around it, then I had a hard time delegating and empowering others. So if I was more spacious and was less ego-driven, I think I would have been more empowering and delegating. It would have been much, much more rewarding and fun and growth oriented for them than having me try to micromanage them, which I used to at times do. For me, it would have been a lot less stress, and I would have not been involved so much in the details and this micromanagement, and been able to step back and do the more strategic things and nourish myself. And then that would have fed my quality of life, my family, and how it impacted me and my wife, my kids, and my presence at home. But with that kind of more spaciousness and more resource quality, I would have been a lot more creative and strategic in my work. So it would have benefited everybody at multiple levels, personally, and my personal sphere of influence, my family, and my team at work.
That's awesome. One of the cool things that's happening and that you are contributing to is that you are actively, as a psychologist and as an executive coach, helping CEOs and helping them create more spiritual cultures. I guess the first question is, with the idea of separating church and state, so to speak, how is spirituality non-religious? That's thing one. And thing two is, what are some of the calisthenics or exercises you might put your leaders through in order for them to be more spiritually connected as it informs their leadership?
Well, I think you're raising an important point. I don't necessarily talk about it spiritual or not. And yeah, it's separation of church and state. I'm not advocating any religion or any particular philosophy. Some of my clients are atheists and don't believe in spirituality or whatever, but yet they develop their spiritual intelligence working with me, and they can find themselves in states that are egoless. I'll give you one example. I'm writing a chapter in my book right now on this quality of egolessness. So one of my clients was an entrepreneur whose first company was super successful and was kind of a consumer app, game, etc. And he kind of believed that he had this identity that I'm a great, successful thing. He did it in another company, raised all this money, built a great team, and yet the product bombed. And after several iterations, and he was really struggling to deal with his identity as I thought I was a successful designer, but this is not working. And a lot of his mental energy was trying to reconcile his self-identity, his egoic identity, if I was to use a technical term, with the reality of what he was getting. But this identity of being a smart, successful, while in a sense it's positive, it can also becomes limiting. He imagined all his identities. I had him put them in his hand, and he felt the weight of all of that. I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a this, I'm a that, I'm a that, all of these egoic identities of what we take ourselves to be. And I simply had him throw them behind his head, and all of a sudden he was like, who and what is he beyond these identities? And that's when his mood lightened up and he could think creatively, and he wasn't preoccupied like to reconcile his egoic identity with the reality. Now, this is kind of, moving to an egoless state for a moment. And our egos, we don't get rid of them. They come back and we need them and so on. That was an example of a spiritual intelligence quality coming through without any of the theology or metaphysics of religion or spirituality. So you can cultivate and invoke these qualities in people, and they could see the benefits of that without preaching any spiritual or religious dogma or view or philosophy.
And what I like is that you're speaking to the temporal nature of being egoless, that it's not a permanent binary state, that you're either egoless or with ego, that it visits you at times, and there are times when you need a little break from the ego. And I'm wondering what would be some exercises that you would perhaps challenge the listener to try on their own that might benefit them as leaders based on your own experience?
Okay. Well, a couple of things I would say. Yes, our egos can move. We don't need to get rid of the ego. The ego is there, but we just don't need to have it be the driver in the bus. So the minute you see your ego and say, oh, here I'm being motivated by my ego, then you're disidentified from your ego. And that's it. And you can make a more intelligent choice that is informed by your higher self, by something more essential, by your soul, by your spirit, by your true authentic self. So the ego is there, and that's fine. And we don't want to kill it. That would be a spiritual ambition that is unlikely for most of us and anybody that I know, certainly not for me personally. But when you think about it, just for the last few minutes, as you and I are here talking, if this conversation is engaging, then you're listening, I'm observing you, the words are just flowing. Was there a sense of me that you experienced, whether you as Adam or you as the listener? But if I say, okay, think about it a minute ago, you say, oh yeah, that was me that was listening. But when we're engaged with something that's absorbing us, it could be reading a book or a movie or going down the slope on a ski, they might call it a flow state. We're totally absorbed. There's no duality between the self and the object, the subject and the object. So, actually egoless states are there all the time. We just don't recognize them as such, because we reflect back and say, oh yeah, that was me that watched the movie. Somebody will come and say, what have you been doing? And you say, I was watching the movie. But while you're watching the movie, there's just the watching, and you're absorbed into the movie. That's an egoless state. So this is not some magical thing.
But you're saying name states, name qualities, kind of the naming thing can really help a person be more connected, perhaps more spiritual, perhaps more inspired as a leader. And I'm wondering in that vein, if you were to perhaps name a few of the leaders who you love throughout time. Oh, and before we do, it's funny. I was just thinking about the egoic state versus the non-egoic state. There's around the time of Christ, there was a rabbi by the name of Hillel who said, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? And it's kind of a koan. It's like, to your point about the ego state, that we must rely on the ego at times, and we must also be free of it lest we become narcissistic and awful. But I'm wondering, when you think about the leaders who've really, really kind of rocked your world and viewed through the spiritual lens that you use, how would you describe some of those leaders? You described Steve Jobs very in his I think he actually ate lunch with Johnny Ives almost every day, his lead designer. He was so obsessed with design, much to the benefit of everyone. But who are some of the leaders who come to your mind, and how would you view them or describe them through the lens of spiritual leadership?
Yeah, well, I'll just make an anecdote about Steve Jobs. And again, I don't use him as an exemplar of spiritually intelligent or inspired leader, but he did certainly have some wisdom. But what is very little known about Steve Jobs is the one book that he had on his iPad that he read every year was the autobiography of a yogi. And the books that he turned to for his own inspiration were all spiritual books, like Be Here Now.
Ram Dass.
Ram Dass. And those were his thing. But anyway, but to your question, if you look at some of the world's greatest leaders and people I hail, I think of Gandhi. And Gandhi said, when you reduce yourself to zero, you become unstoppable because you're egoless. Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela. These are people that have done incredible things, risked their lives in the name of a cause or a mission or a vision. They were fully devoted to that, and they inspired millions and billions of people to follow them. And they were all grounded in spiritual values. And it was not about their ego or their fame or their wealth, but it was their vision of a better world that they devoted their lives to. And you could sense the power that you have when you are that committed and devoted, where you're fully 120 whatever percent behind that at any cost. And of course, you're going to be the most powerful then, because you, even if you risk your life and whatever, and of course, in the business world, that's unlikely to be the case. But going back to what I said about Jim Collins and his research, is the two qualities he identified was humility and fierce resolve. And so the people I just named, like Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, are examples of people that were devoted to a cause that was much greater than themselves. And they were fierce about it, and they were willing to give up their lives for it.
And one of the things that I'm really getting from you, just even as I get to geek out with you, is I feel your enthusiasm. And that's a term that to me has spiritual connotations. Enthusiasm. How do you inspire people without enthusiasm? You really can't. And what is enthusiasm? To me, is the byproduct of something deep and authentic, and the byproduct of engaging in flow-based activities. Kind of for the flow realm, it's when meaning and challenge intersect, kind of simply put. And I see this as a very meaningful and challenging thing that you are able to articulate with great enthusiasm. So even as you are helping people become more spiritually connected as leaders, you embody so much of what you're already talking about. And one of the things that people can do, if they're interested, is go onto your website and take an inventory to find out the various dimensions relative to themselves, and even get a 360 if they wish, to find out what types of spiritual leaders they are. I was wondering if you could speak to the inventory that you've carefully crafted. I can only imagine the dozens, if not hundreds of hours that were placed into this inventory, and how might leaders benefit from tapping into that resource?
Okay, sure. Before I do that, I'm going to rewind for 1 second, if that's okay.
Of course.
You said about enthusiasm. So, I call this inspired leadership. So I always ask my clients, and do you want to be an inspirational leader, or do you want to be an inspired leader? And most people are puzzled. What's the difference? I want to be inspirational. But when you think about it, how do you determine if you're inspirational? You have to look outside of you and see the effect. So if your goal is to be inspirational, you're kind of thinking about your impact on other people, which of course you have to do at some level. But I think first you get inspired, you get lit up, and then you have this flame, this light, and that lights up a resonant flame with people so I call this first inspired leadership. First and foremost, you get inspired. And otherwise you're confusing cause and effect.
Yep.
First, as a leader, you got to be inspired by your vision, by your cause, by whatever it is that's driving you. And when you are inspired, then you have that enthusiasm, you have that energy, you have that vibrancy, that aliveness that draws people to you. So the cause is being inspired, the effect is being inspirational on others.
Such a beautiful distinction. I'm so glad you made it.
Yeah.
And I was vibing with you the entire time. And I'm glad I got the answer to the question right mentally as you were relaying it.
But back to the inventory thing. So yeah, there is a website called intelligency.com. Intelligency is like a play on the word intelligence, except with CE, it's SI. And there is a free assessment of spiritual intelligence that someone could take there that tells you kind of your strengths and your opportunities to grow on these 22 dimensions. There are 22 dimensions of spiritual intelligence, and you could take this assessment. It's the free basic one, takes about 10 minutes or 10, 15 minutes, and it will give you your strengths and your opportunities to grow. And it's all relative to you. This is not a spiritual ego. We're not saying, okay, you are in this percentile of the population and your spiritual IQ is 150, your 3 standard deviation about, because it's a self-assessment. It's all normalized against yourself to see what are your relative strengths, what are your relative opportunities. And so there is that assessment there. There's also a 360 assessment where you can invite 4 other people to give you feedback on those same qualities. And then you could see how is your self-perception aligned with how other people perceive you. And you might discover you have some hidden strengths. You might not think you're so compassionate, you're hard on yourself, but other people experience you as very compassionate. On the other hand, there might be some qualities that you think, oh, these are my strengths, but for whatever reason, other people don't experience that. So that could be a yellow flag for you, which if you're open and interested, is a great opportunity to learn and grow, but you have to have the courage. And then there's an assessment related to inspired leadership, which looks at it specifically through the lens of leadership. And both, again, you could do a self-assessment or you could do a 360, and you could overall see what your self-assessment and how it matches with how you're being perceived by the people around you. It could be your teammates, your board, your boss, your colleagues that are at the same level. And so, yeah, people find it a powerful tool to discover themselves and learn and grow from it. There are tips for development and practices that are suggested there for people.
Such a great thing. And as you're speaking, I'm thinking about one of the things that shows up kind of in the industrial organizational psychology research. And that is, you could be working for a great company and be working with a terrible boss. And that informs everything about your experience at that so-called great company, because we are people. We have mirror neurons. We are socially wired creatures. And if we have a crap boss who is very, very uninspired, who is very emotionally unintelligent, and perhaps even mean, our day-to-day is going to suck. And I am so glad that you're here to help people lean into their strengths, become aware of what they need to become more aware of, perhaps through a 360, and that you are helping the conversation around the ripple effects that corporations have on all of society based on the principles they hold near and dear and that they actually walk in day to day. I do believe that if more companies are able to lean into kindness and the time-tested spiritual descriptors that you are trying to help people identify and to rock more and creating a great business case for, that this will go way beyond the corporate structures themselves. There's just ample research that shows that there is a ripple effect. That said, I want to ask you, before I get to my final question here, Yossi, is there anything I should have asked but haven't yet asked?
No question pops to mind yet. I'll let it germinate and see if something comes up. But just to build on what you said about the importance of that, for better or worse, these days work is people's most significant community. We spend 40, 50 more hours a week in our work environment, and it is our most significant community, especially with the pandemic. And we're more and more people are in single person households. There's a loneliness epidemic. And there is ample research now that shows that the more people are connected and fulfilled at work, the better their mood, the better their productivity, and so on. So, yeah, creating a sense of community, belonging, a team atmosphere, a team spirit, shared purpose, shared meaning is hugely important. And it's kind of paradoxical because we have all this social media and connection through what have you, but people still feel lonely and there's so much toxicity there. So it's really having those deeper connections that feel human, that feel supportive, that we're working towards a common goal in relationship to other people that care about us as human beings is so important for our health and well-being and ultimately productivity. And also the research is that companies that focus on multiple stakeholders, not just financial returns, but on the community, the quality of their employees' lives, in the long run, they produce better financial returns again. So the idea that the corporation exists simply to maximize shareholder return actually it is self-defeating, doesn't work. So yeah, work is super important, and creating an environment that's fulfilling and nourishing at multiple levels for all stakeholders is very synergistic for everybody.
Could not agree more. Yesterday on LinkedIn, I don't know to whom this quote is attributable, but I saw in Heather White, former guest on my podcast, she's really written about ways to reduce our anxiety as it relates to the environment. But she basically said, burnt out people lead to a burnt out planet. And I just thought that was really good and really true, and that there's a ripple effect, and that work environment itself can serve either as an exacerbating mechanism to reinforce our bad childhoods or a corrective mechanism whereby we can actually have corrective parenting through our bosses or corrective experiences. And I think about the best boss I ever had in the corporate sphere. His name was Martin Dorner. May his memory be a blessing. He saw me. He mentored me. He gave me a new experience. He turned my .com experience into more of a .edu experience where I was earning for the company for sure. I was definitely year over year making good money for the company. But in the same time, I was learning. And I really like thinking of the corporate life or our work life as being just another educational opportunity, both intellectually, academically, as well as interpersonally and intra-psychically in terms of fortifying ourselves. So I'm just really grateful to you for doing these things. That said, I have my final miraculous question, and that is this, Yossi.
Okay.
If you had the magical capacity to confer upon all humanity one insight or one skill that would dramatically improve the quality of the lives of both the person with that skill or insight, as well as those around them, what would that skill or insight be? And how do you imagine it would impact both the person as well as society at large?
So what I would say is, if you look at our world, most resources are finite. So if I have $100 in my pocket and I give you $1, I'm left with 99. If I have so much gas in my tank or so much battery on my electrical vehicle, I drive some, I have less energy left. But imagine that if I had this $100 in my pocket and I gave you $1, and instead of ending up with 99, I ended up with 101. And every time I gave away $1, I end up with a little more than I started. Well, what would I do? Of course, I'd want to spread my dollars. Well, that doesn't quite work in the world of money. But let's take a resource that is like that, self-regenerating and multiplicative, and that's love. If I have love in my heart and I somehow express it through kindness, through generosity, through appreciation, but I share that love with you or with someone, I don't have any less love in my heart. In fact, my heart's capacity and the amount of love that I can tap into and feel has grown. So the more love I spread, the more kindness I share, the more generosity, the more appreciation. Those are all different expressions of love to everybody. Whether it comes back directly to me or not, I have more love. Other people around me benefit. So I think the more we share the love in our hearts, the more our heart's capacity for love grows, the more nourished we are, our well-being is improved, and everybody around us.
I love that synergistic idea of every time we give $1, we get $1. And the synergistic approach, everything you're saying about the spiritual leadership idea is so important. And it is so synergistic, both to the leader and to the shareholders and to the people behind shareholders. And it reminds me of that African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And what you're suggesting takes time, but I think the ROI and the measurable and the immeasurable, the really important stuff that goes beyond measure, all will benefit if they are able to espouse your ideas. I'm a fan. I'm so grateful that you're sharing your wisdom and heart with my listeners. You heard it, folks, from a Harvard MBA, someone who saying love is a thing at the company level, and there is a business case for it. So I just love that so much. I can't even begin. And of course, I'm not just limiting it to a business case. It's beyond the business case. It's an existential case, if I may be so bold as to say that it is that those two things and more. Thank you so much, Yossi. This was a blast.
Thank you, Adam. I'm delighted. And you're doing it through your podcast. I mean, we're all part of it. We're all in this together. And that's the key thing we also need to recognize is so much of our culture is about my individual freedom and my expression. And that's important and huge. But also we need to remember we're in this together. And so we're all trying to move the ball forward or elevate our consciousness for a better world for us and all of us.
Yeah, I think that's the only winning formula. Thanks, my man. This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.